6 days. That was all the Crowley family had before the prairie froze too hard to build anything at all. Their neighbors raised cabin walls. Bennett Crowley raised a tipi. The laughter spread faster than the winter wind. Some called it desperation. Others called it madness. One rancher gave it a different name: the smoke trap. No one believed a canvas lodge could survive a high plains winter. Not through blizzards. Not through nights near 40 below. Yet before spring returned, families would walk across Raven Butte Basin to study the shelter they had mocked. Because the only home that carried children safely through the worst nights of that winter was the one almost everyone expected to fail. Early December 1885. The Crowley family had never planned to spend an entire winter inside a tipi. Months earlier, they had purchased a modest claim in Raven Butte Basin and intended to arrive before the first hard frost. A small log cabin was always part of the plan. The frontier had chosen otherwise. A wagon axle snapped more than 40 miles from the claim. Bennett spent 3 full days shaping a replacement from rough timber. By then, autumn floods had carried away a narrow bridge, forcing the family onto a longer trail. The freight wagon carrying their lumber reached the settlement first, waited as long as it could, then turned back before winter closed the roads. When the Crowleys' mud-spattered wagon finally rolled into the basin, they were greeted by only a meager pile of remaining wood. 13-year-old Elsie stared blankly at the thin braces. Her 8-year-old brother Owen huddled against the family dog, Flint, seeking a fraction of warmth against the bitter wind. The lumber was enough for a raised sleeping frame, a fuel rack, a few braces. Nowhere near enough for a cabin. Gideon Pike, the local cabin builder, studied the supplies without mockery. He said a simple lean-to could be built, but even working quickly, it would take at least 2 weeks. Bennett drove an iron bar into the ground. It sank only a few inches before striking frozen earth. He looked toward the low afternoon sun, the ponds already freezing every night, and the gray clouds gathering over the northern horizon. 2 weeks no longer existed. Later that evening, his wife, Mara Crowley, opened the chest that held curtains and quilts meant for cabin windows. She rested her hands on them for a moment, then quietly began measuring each piece of cloth as if it were building material instead. Years earlier, before Raven Butte Basin ever appeared on a map in his plans, Bennett Crowley had worked as a freight hand crossing the Great Plains. One bitter week, a blizzard stranded his wagon train beside a winter camp built by a Cheyenne family. There, an elderly woman named Atsa Red Crane welcomed the travelers to wait out the storm. She never claimed the lodge was warm because it was thick. Instead, she showed how it worked. She pressed a hand against the outer cover. It turns the wind and sheds the snow. Then she lifted the inner liner. It keeps a quiet layer of air where warmth belongs. She pointed toward the ground near the entrance. Cold air comes in low. Next came the fire pit. The fire warms that air. Her hand followed the rising smoke toward the opening above. The smoke must always have a clear path. Finally, she walked outside and brushed fresh snow against the base of the lodge before pulling it back several inches. Snow can stop the wind. It must never press against the cover. Before the storm ended, she adjusted the smoke flaps twice as the wind shifted across the prairie. One sentence remained with Bennett, long after every other detail had faded. A lodge does not stay warm because it is closed. It stays warm because it breathes in the right places. He never forgot the principle. He never built an entire winter lodge himself. Now, with only days before the ground froze solid, he sketched the design across a weathered board. He erased the distance between the outer cover and the inner liner, drew it again, measured, erased it once more. Mara watched without speaking. At last, she laid a ruler beside the sketch. "We'll prove every measurement after it's standing." Bennett nodded once. Memory had carried the idea this far. The rest would have to be earned. Day 1 began without a single pole touching the ground. Bennett Crowley refused to build beside the wagon simply because it was convenient. A shelter would stand through winter or fail because of the land beneath it long before canvas or timber made any difference. He crossed the claim on foot. Dry grass bent in uneven lines beneath the wind. Thin patches of snow gathered in shallow pockets. He lit a handful of prairie grass and watched the smoke creep across the ground before rising. Every change revealed another invisible current. Flint wandered ahead without command. The dog stopped at a low hollow, sniffed the frozen earth, then turned away. Twice he circled it. Twice he refused to lie down. Owen pushed a stake into the soft-looking ground. It seemed sheltered. Bennett drove his digging bar beside it. Only a few inches below the frozen crust, the soil turned dark and damp. The hollow would collect meltwater when winter broke. Until then, it would trap the coldest air every night. He pulled the stake free. The family climbed a gentle rise instead. It stood above the basin floor. The ground sloped slightly toward the east. A low ridge softened the northwest wind without blocking it. The entrance could face east-southeast, welcoming the morning sun while turning away from the harshest winter gusts. The wagon remained close enough for supplies, but far enough that smoke would never drift beneath its canvas. Elsie stretched a measuring line while Bennett marked a circle 15 feet, 6 inches across. He paused before setting the first poles. 3 would have been enough on calmer plains. Not here. The crosswinds sweeping Raven Butte Basin demanded 4 primary poles to steady the frame. As they worked, Gideon Pike rode past and studied the circle. "A shelter without a sill can slide on frozen ground," he said evenly. Bennett offered no argument. He simply looked at the marked circle once more, committing the warning to memory before the first pole was ever raised. Day 2 belonged to the frame. The Crowleys hauled 18 cedar and lodgepole poles, each nearly 20 feet long, from a stand below the ridge. Bennett lashed the 4 primary poles together with softened rawhide. He, Mara, and Elsie raised the first cluster, while Owen hurried willow pegs from one side of the circle to the other. Flint dragged a short guide rope, tied to a small stake, earning a tired smile before returning to the wind. One by one, the remaining poles settled into place. By afternoon, the frame stood against the gray sky. Then a stronger gust struck. A western pole slid several inches across the frozen ground. The entire structure leaned. Bennett pulled against it, but 2 more poles shifted with the strain. Gideon Pike's warning had been right. Instead of hiding the mistake, Bennett loosened the lashings. Shallow, wide footing pockets replaced the narrow ones. Cross pins locked the bases. Deadman anchors disappeared beneath the last soil they could still dig. Rawhide braces followed the true load paths, and 2 windward poles received new angles. The repair cost nearly half a day. As Elsie's palms split from holding the tension rope, Mara wrapped them with a strip of cloth and quietly showed her where to grip instead. Winter did not pause while they learned. Day 3 was reserved for the outer cover. The Crowleys did not own enough buffalo hides to build a traditional winter lodge. Mara solved the problem with what the wagon still carried. Old freight canvas became the largest panels. 3 treated cowhides covered the most exposed sections. 2 worn buffalo robes, no longer thick enough for bedding, reinforced the upper slope. Smaller canvas pieces, rubbed with animal grease and beeswax, filled the remaining gaps. Rawhide lacing joined every section, while each patch faced downhill so melting snow would shed water instead of driving beneath the seams. Bennett pulled one edge tight. "Tighter," he said. Mara shook her head. "If it sounds like a drum, the wind will tear it apart." She eased the cover back. It remained firm enough to stay clear of the poles, yet flexible enough to yield under hard gusts. Every major seam turned away from the prevailing northwest wind. Along the bottom edge, the cover rested against pegs instead of being forced flat against the frozen ground. She pressed a palm against the canvas. It moved only slightly. That was enough. Hollis Crane, the settlement's firewood merchant, stopped beside the claim and looked up at the shelter. "One spark," he called, tapping the canvas with a finger, "and you've built the biggest torch in the basin." Then he glanced at the small pile of fuel, planning to keep those children warm with buffalo chips and grass bundles. Bennett never raised his voice. "If the shelter keeps the heat, it won't need a big fire." Hollis laughed as he rode away. Behind him, Mara quietly cut a narrow strip from the curtain she had sewn for the cabin that would never be finished before winter. Without a word, she stitched it into the outer cover. Bennett watched the scissors pass through the cloth. He said nothing. The cabin had been postponed. Keeping the family alive had not. Day 4 belonged to the part no passerby would ever notice. Mara hung the inner liner just under 6 feet, 8 inches high, using blanket panels, light canvas, thin hides, and rope loops tied around the poles. It never touched the outer cover. Depending on the slope of the wall, the gap measured anywhere from 5 to 9 inches. That empty space mattered more than another blanket. Owen weighed the lower edge with stones, rolled bedding, and sacks filled with dry grass. Near the fire pit, Mara deliberately left a narrow opening. "It has to breathe here," she said quietly. Elsie tied short strands of wool at several points inside the lodge. When the afternoon wind returned, the tiny fibers revealed what no eye could see. Cold air slipped beneath the liner. It climbed through the hidden space between the two walls instead of sweeping across the sleeping area. Little by little, the draft bent toward the future fire pit. The system was beginning to work. Late in the day, Lenora Shaw, a widow who had cooked on cattle trails through many winters, stepped inside. She studied the liner without offering praise. Finally, she pointed to one section where the fabric had drifted too close to the outer cover. "A right idea can still kill people if it's built wrong." Bennett measured the gap again. "It should be enough," Mara answered with silence. She marked the spot with a piece of charcoal. As evening settled over the basin, Bennett walked past the mark without changing it. A few moments later, Elsie quietly traced it again, making the warning impossible to overlook. Day 5 finally brought fire inside the lodge. Mara stretched a partial ozone above the sleeping area, using light canvas and worn blanket panels. The overhead liner sloped lower along the outside wall, then gradually climbed toward the smoke corridor. It never covered the fire pit. Its purpose was simple: keep warmth from collecting uselessly beneath the peak while protecting the bedding from cold downdrafts. Bennett finished the fire pit beneath the opening. It measured about 28 inches across and was surrounded by dry stones that had been heated slowly beside a small practice fire before being placed in the ring. Any stone that cracked was discarded before it could become dangerous. Near the entrance, he opened the low-air inlet. The change was immediate. Fresh air fed the flames. The fire burned brighter. Smoke climbed cleanly toward the smoke hole. That evening, for the first time, the lodge felt warmer than the wagon they had slept in only days before. The improvement lasted only minutes. Smoke curled beneath the edge of the ozone. Elsie coughed. Flint lifted his head, sniffed the air once, then quietly left his place beside the children. Bennett reached for the smoke flap poles. "More draft," he said. Mara was already looking somewhere else. The ozone stretched farther than she had intended. In trying to protect the sleeping area from downdrafts, she had narrowed the smoke corridor itself. Without hesitation, she took out her knife. One cut, then another. She carved a notch through the best blanket panel and lifted the edge clear of the rising smoke. Within moments, the gray layer broke apart. The smoke climbed freely again. Warmth returned. So did clean air. No one celebrated. The lesson had arrived too quickly. A winter lodge could not simply trap heat. Every part depended on every other. By the 6th day, the temperature had fallen to 9 degrees below freezing and continued dropping. The wagon was no longer an option. The Crowleys carried their lives into the lodge even though the work remained unfinished. The smoke flaps had never been tested under shifting winds. Several sections of the inner liner still lacked spacers. The fuel rack held only part of the winter supply. The bedding rested barely 10 inches above the frozen ground on grass, woven mats, and a low wooden frame. The air channel still stopped short of leading directly toward the fire pit. Winter would not wait for perfection. Bennett hung 2 heavy curtains across the entrance, leaving a narrow space between them to form a simple airlock. Mara spread the bedding around the outer edge of the lodge, careful to keep every blanket clear of the liner. Elsie suspended an old thermometer beside the sleeping area. She tied another short strand of wool near the entrance, then marked the first frost line on one of the poles with a piece of charcoal. Owen stacked every kind of fuel separately: dry buffalo chips, bundles of twisted prairie grass, willow twigs, cottonwood roots. A few precious hardwood pieces remained untouched for emergencies. When the fire settled into steady coals, Flint circled the lodge once. He ignored the warm stones. He ignored the fire. Instead, he curled beside the southwest section of the liner. Bennett watched without interrupting him. The dog had chosen the place where the warmth felt even. The air remained clean, and no draft crossed the bedding. Outside, darkness settled across Raven Butte Basin, and the temperature dropped to 4 degrees. Inside, an unfinished shelter prepared to face its first night. Beneath the ozone, the old thermometer settled between 35 and 37 degrees. Only a small fire burned. 5 living bodies shared the warmth. A pot of stew simmered above the coals. The outer cover and inner liner held the heat where it belonged. It was far warmer than the wagon had ever been. It still was not comfortable. Owen slept without shivering for the first time since reaching Raven Butte Basin. Flint never changed position. At dawn, Mara folded back the bedding 1 layer at a time. Her hand stopped on the wedding quilt. One corner felt damp. Not soaked. Just wet enough to matter. Elsie lowered her eyes. "I saw frost on the liner last night." She hesitated. "I didn't say anything. I thought we'd have to take everything apart again." Mara walked directly to the charcoal mark she had drawn the day before. The wind had pressed the outer cover against the liner during the night. The 2 layers touched. Moisture crossed through that single contact point. Then it ran down onto the bedding. Bennett stared at the quilt. "We could build a hotter fire." Mara laid one hand on the damp cloth before looking back at him. "A bigger fire won't change where the water travels." He said nothing. Together they loosened the liner despite the bitter morning air. Willow spacers restored the missing gap. The ropes were tightened again. A narrow drainage gap opened beneath the affected section. Only after the work was finished did Bennett look toward the charcoal mark. Lenora Shaw had been right. He had remembered the principle. He had not remembered every measurement. Before breakfast, Bennett handed Elsie a fresh piece of charcoal. "From now on," he said quietly, "mark everything we don't want to see." Separating the liner from the outer cover solved the moisture problem. The next night uncovered another one. The wind almost disappeared. The fire burned low. Smoke stopped rising with confidence. Instead, it lingered beneath the peak. Bennett widened the low air inlet beside the entrance. The change worked immediately. Fresh air reached the fire. The flames brightened. Smoke climbed cleanly through the opening above. Then Owen pulled his blanket tighter. A thin stream of cold air crossed the bedding. The short strand of wool hanging nearby leaned sharply toward him. Flint stood, walked across the lodge, and lay between Owen and the draft. Bennett studied the entrance. "We need a screen." Mara shook her head. "A screen only moves the draft." She knelt beside the doorway. "It doesn't tell the air where to go." The next morning they dug a shallow channel from outside the double curtains toward the fire pit. It measured about 6 inches deep and 6 inches wide. A small canvas flap allowed the opening to be adjusted. Wooden slats and packed earth covered most of the trench so no one would step into it. That evening, The cold air entered the channel instead of flowing across the bedding. It traveled directly toward the fire. The flames warmed it. The heated air rose through the center of the lodge exactly as Otsa Red Crane had once demonstrated. Elsie watched the strand of wool. It barely moved. The shelter was finally beginning to breathe in the right places. Before lying down, Owen quietly shifted his bedding a little farther over. He left enough room beside him for Flint. This time, the dog no longer had to block the cold. A light snowfall settled across Raven Butte Basin. By morning, the north side of the lodge wore a thin white blanket. Owen remembered something his father had said. Snow could block the wind. Wanting to help before anyone else woke, he carried a small shovel outside and packed snow tightly against the northern wall of the lodge. That night, the canvas barely moved. The shelter felt quieter. Owen smiled to himself. He believed he had solved another problem. At first light, Mara walked around the outside during her usual inspection. She stopped immediately. The lower canvas felt soft beneath her glove. Cold. One patched section had begun holding moisture. Along the place where the snow pressed directly against the cover, a narrow ribbon of ice had formed. When the weather warmed even slightly, that ice would melt. Water would follow the seams. She called Bennett outside. He looked at Owen's work, then crouched beside his son. "You fixed the wind," he said. Owen nodded. "But now watch what the snow is doing." He brushed away one section until the canvas was exposed again. "This snow protects us." He pointed at the packed ridge touching the wall. "This snow becomes water." There was no anger, only another lesson. Together they cleared every drift, resting against the cover. Then the family built a low brush fence about 10 inches from the wall. Fresh snow collected against the fence instead. The air gap remained open. A narrow drainage space stayed clear beneath the edge. Wind slowed before reaching the lodge. Moisture no longer touched the canvas. Owen measured the distance himself around the entire shelter, checking each section twice. Before going inside, he brushed every remaining trace of snow away from the patch he had accidentally soaked. He stayed there until Mara pressed the canvas with her hand and finally nodded. Only then did he put the shovel away. 2 weeks later, the basin fell to 18 degrees below zero. The lodge had changed since the first night. The frame stood firmly on its anchors. The liner remained separated from the outer cover. The ozone carried its smoke notch. The air channel fed the fire directly. The snowbank rested behind the brush fence. The fuel rack stood above the frozen ground. The double entrance curtains slowed every blast of wind. Elsie checked the thermometer before sunrise. Outside. -18. Near the entrance floor. 21. Beneath the ozone. 47. Behind the liner. 31. The fuel rack remained perfectly dry. That night, the family burned little more than buffalo chips, twisted grass bundles, several cottonwood roots, and one short piece of hardwood after midnight. The heated stones had been warmed slowly, wrapped in several layers of hide, and placed near the foot of the bedding instead of beneath anyone's body. Owen fell asleep without wearing his coat. Flint never left his place beside the southwest wall. For the first time since reaching Raven Butte Basin, Bennett allowed himself to believe the lodge was finally finished. Mara never said the same. She studied the frost line climbing higher on one of the poles. Outside, the morning temperature had already begun to rise. Warmer air often brought more moisture. The next lesson, she suspected, had only been delayed. The following afternoon, the temperature climbed to nearly 20 degrees. The lodge felt warmer. It also felt heavier. Moisture gathered from every ordinary task. Breath filled the air. Stew simmered above the fire. Damp mittens dried beside the entrance. Snow melted from boots carried inside. Tiny droplets appeared above the liner. A few landed softly on the edge of the ozone. Bennett looked toward the smoke hole. If we close it more, we'll keep the heat. Mara looked upward instead. We'll keep the water. She opened the vent another few inches. The thermometer fell slightly. The air became noticeably drier. From that point forward, every routine changed. Bedding was aired one section at a time. Cooking stayed close to the smoke corridor. Boots remained beside the entrance instead of reaching the sleeping area. Fuel was never used to dry clothing. Mara adjusted the ozone with another slight slope, so every droplet traveled toward the outer edge instead of falling onto the bedding. Bennett watched the thermometer settle several degrees lower. Then he watched Mara wring water from a mitten. He left the vent open. That evening, Elsie added another line to the winter strip: warmer air, wetter lodge. Vent opened. For the first time, Bennett understood that the warmest shelter was not always the safest one. Several days later, Alton Breck, the territorial claim examiner, arrived to inspect the Crowley homestead. He walked slowly around the lodge, writing in a small notebook. No permanent foundation. No wooden sill. No framed roof. No masonry chimney. The poles could be lowered. The cover could be removed. He closed the notebook. This is a temporary encampment. Elsie reached for the winter strip, the measurements from the 18 below night, the fuel records, the temperatures. Bennett gently stopped her. Not because he doubted the numbers, because the lodge had not yet faced its greatest test. Alton looked across the open basin. My job is to record improvements that prove a family intends to stay, Bennett answered calmly. A wall doesn't prove a family will still be here in spring. The examiner made one final note. Temporary dwelling. Nothing more. As Alton prepared to leave, their neighbor, Silas Mercer, stepped forward from beside his framed cabin. There was no mockery in his voice. If a real blizzard comes, he said, bring your family to my place. Don't let pride decide for your children. Silence settled between the adults. Mara looked at Bennett. She waited. We'll come, Bennett said at last. The moment this shelter proves it can no longer keep them safe. After Silas rode away, Mara asked only one question. What would convince you? Bennett answered without hesitation. If smoke stops leaving, if the liner stays wet, if the poles keep moving, or if the children stop staying warm after we've already increased the fuel. Mara nodded once. Neither of them intended to trust hope. Only evidence. By the middle of January 1886, Raven Butte Basin no longer felt the same. The wind stopped wandering. Hour after hour, it held the same direction from the northwest. When Flint stepped outside, he never wandered beyond the entrance before turning back. Silas Mercer's cattle stood with their backs toward the wind long before the first snow arrived. Smoke from nearby cabins flattened close to the ground instead of climbing into the sky. The ice covering the water trough cracked with sharp, brittle reports. Even the brush fell silent. The birds were gone. Bennett had seen enough. A major winter system was already moving across the plains. No one wasted words. The family returned to work. Rawhide braces were tightened, one final time. Every deadman anchor was checked by hand. The last exposed seam received another patch. Every bundle of fuel was inspected and dried. The small reserve of hardwood was separated from the daily supply. The brush fence was straightened. The entrance trench was cleared. The air channel was opened from end to end and checked for blockage. Another curtain was hung inside the entrance, but Bennett left the breathing path untouched. The lodge would never survive by sealing itself shut. The bedding spent one final afternoon outside beneath the pale winter sun. Before dusk, Bennett tested the smoke flap poles again. They moved freely. Inside, Mara divided the remaining fuel into daily portions. Bennett reached toward the larger pile. She quietly moved his hand away. Not tonight. If the storm lasts longer than we expect, we'll need tomorrow's fire as much as today's. He nodded. She was right. Elsie recorded one last entry on the winter strip before darkness settled. Outside. 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind rising. Nearby, Owen walked the north side of the lodge, carrying a short measuring stick. Without anyone reminding him, he checked the 10-inch space between the snowbank and the outer cover all the way around the shelter. Nothing touched the canvas. Nothing trapped moisture. Nothing blocked the drainage gap. When he finished, he smiled only to himself. Flint circled once beneath the ozone before lying down. His head faced the entrance. His ears remained pointed toward the wind. The final piece of hardwood rested alone beside the fuel rack. Mara placed her hand on it for a moment, only if the children began to shiver. No one reached for it. No one argued. Outside, the prairie had stopped giving warnings. Now, nature would measure every decision they had made. The storm announced itself with wind before snow ever arrived. By dawn of the first day, old snow was already lifting from the prairie in long white ribbons. The lodge shook. It never lurched. Its flexible frame bent with each hard gust, then quietly settled back into place. Outside, drifting snow piled against the brush fence instead of pressing against the outer cover. The 10-inch air gap remained open. Inside, the liner moved only enough to remind them the wind was still searching for a weakness. On the second day, the wind strengthened. One violent gust pushed the smoke flaps out of balance. Bennett adjusted the control poles. The correction took only moments. Cold air continued flowing through the air channel toward the fire pit. The flames stayed clean. Smoke climbed where it belonged. The third day tested everyone else. Across the basin, Silas Mercer fed larger and larger logs into the fireplace inside his frame cabin. The fire roared. Cold drafts slipped through shrinking chinking between the logs. Every change in the wind made the chimney pull differently. Heat vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Not far away, Hollis Crane discovered that much of his stacked firewood had frozen beneath a hard shell of snow and ice. The wet logs smoked. They burned slowly. They consumed far more fuel, while giving back less warmth. Inside the lodge, Elsie quietly checked the instruments. Outside, -23. Beneath the ozone, 48. Fuel rack. Dry. Liner. No contact. Smoke. Clear. No one celebrated the numbers. They already understood what they meant. The lodge stayed warm because still air remained where the family needed it. Not because the fire burned bigger. That night, Owen slept through the loudest gusts yet. Before lying down himself, Bennett pulled one more blanket over the boy's shoulder. Then his eyes drifted toward the emergency hardwood reserve. Every piece remained untouched. On the fourth night, everything changed. Without warning, the wind shifted from the northwest to the northeast. The smoke flap setting that had worked flawlessly for 3 days failed within minutes. Smoke stopped rising, instead curling into gray ribbons beneath the ozone. Before anyone could even cough, Flint stood up. He moved near the floor by the entrance, where the air remained cleaner. Bennett grabbed a control pole and pulled, but it was no use. The outer smoke flap had frozen solid against its lashings. "I'll climb out," he said, reaching for his coat. "Wait." Mara stopped him. She lowered the lantern toward the center of the lodge, studying the leaning flame and the trapped smoke. "The flap isn't too small. It's just fighting the wrong pressure." Understanding her point, instead of forcing the frozen flap open, Bennett shifted to the opposite control pole. Elsie helped him hold the first pole steady. Together, they changed the angle of the flaps rather than the size of the opening. At the same time, Mara briefly opened the lower air flap. Fresh air rushed into the fire. The smoke hesitated for a moment before lifting cleanly toward the peak. Once the draft stabilized, she reduced the air intake to prevent unnecessary heat loss. Balance was restored. No one had to risk stepping outside into the blizzard or climbing onto an ice-covered roof. The lodge breathed correctly once more. Across the fire, Elsie held the control pole exactly where her father had told her, keeping it steady until her watch ended. The fifth day arrived with less wind. The drifting snow remained. Around Silas Mercer's cabin, one heavy drift had climbed high enough to choke part of the chimney. Inside, the fireplace still burned, barely. Silas closed the damper another little step, afraid the remaining heat would disappear up the stack. Across the room, Ruth Mercer, Silas's wife, noticed their young son, Caleb Mercer, had stopped complaining about the cold. He had become quiet. Too quiet. His breathing slowed. His eyes no longer followed the fire. The smoke inside the cabin was never thick enough to alarm anyone. That made it more dangerous. Ruth forced the door open. The drift outside resisted her. At almost the same moment, Bennett stepped outside to clear the entrance trench around the lodge after the wind eased. Flint froze. Then the dog turned toward the Mercer cabin and barked without stopping. Bennett looked at the roofline. No steady plume rose from the chimney. Instead, thin smoke leaked low along the roof before disappearing into the blowing snow. The fire still lived. The draft was dying. He grabbed a rope, tied one end around his waist, and secured the other to the lodge. Without another word, he headed into the storm. Inside the cabin, Bennett threw the damper wide open. Then he fought through the drift outside, breaking away the packed snow around the chimney base until the stack could breathe again. Fresh air rushed through the fireplace. The smoke lifted. It was enough. Not enough to stay. Ruth wrapped Caleb and stepped toward the door. Silas hesitated. "My blankets." Ruth placed Caleb against his chest. Silas looked down at his son. He never turned back toward the cabin. One by one, they followed the rope through the blowing snow until the outline of the teepee emerged from the white. The shelter everyone had mocked opened its entrance. By the time the storm passed, the wind disappeared. The sky cleared. The temperature plunged instead. For 2 straight nights, the basin approached 40 degrees below zero. Without strong winds, the lodge could no longer rely on nature to help draw the smoke upward. Everything depended entirely on careful operation. Now, 7 souls and 1 dog shared the shelter. More bodies brought more warmth. However, they also created more moisture and demanded more fresh air. Nothing happened by habit anymore. The air channel stayed open only as much as the fire required. Smoke flaps were adjusted for calm air instead of hard wind. The ozone held warmth above the sleeping circle. Cooking remained brief. Bedding dried outside in rotation whenever daylight allowed. Fuel followed Mara's daily ration, without exception. Heated stones, warmed slowly, and wrapped in several layers of hide, rested beside Caleb's bedding. The entrance curtains were never opened together. Every movement protected the balance. Caleb stopped shivering. Soon afterward, he fell asleep. Silas watched his son breathing quietly beneath the ozone inside the shelter he had once believed could never protect a family. He offered no apology. When Bennett checked the evening fuel, Silas simply reached for a bundle of twisted prairie grass and placed it silently into Bennett's hands. Nothing more needed to be said. When the weather finally settled, visitors came one by one. Alton Breck returned first. So did Gideon Pike. Hollis Crane arrived later. Lenora Shaw followed quietly behind them. No ceremony waited outside the lodge. Only evidence. The poles still stood straight. The snowbank rested behind the brush fence instead of against the cover. The canvas remained dry. The fuel rack still held dry wood and prairie grass. The bedding carried no trace of frost. The winter strip hung beside the entrance, filled with temperatures, adjustments, failures, and corrections recorded across the entire season. Most important of all, 2 families had survived. Alton read every line without speaking. He opened his notebook. For a long moment, no one heard anything except his pencil. Then he drew a single line through his earlier entry. Temporary encampment. Beneath it, he wrote another: functional winter dwelling and emergency shelter. Occupied through 2 nights near 40 below. He closed the notebook. Nothing more was added. Gideon removed one glove and knelt beside a deadman anchor. He checked the tension of the rawhide braces. He pressed one hand against a pole and watched it flex before returning to shape. "It isn't better than a cabin," he finally said. "It doesn't need to be." The following spring, several of Gideon's new cabins quietly gained curved entrance vestibules and flexible wind bracing. No announcement explained why. Hollis Crane never built a tipi. He did raise his fuel racks above the ground. He also began storing kindling beneath ventilated canvas instead of leaving it buried beneath snow. Silas Mercer kept his cabin. He rebuilt the chimney draft. Inside his calving shelter, he hung a simple inner liner to hold still air where newborn calves needed it most. Ruth asked Mara to teach her how to suspend a small ozan inside one drafty room of their cabin. Lenora walked slowly around the lodge before stopping beside the north wall. She reached between the liner and the outer cover. Her hand paused in the familiar gap. "This time," she said quietly, "the distance is right." That was all. Later that spring, another young settler asked Bennett who had invented the system. Bennett never answered with his own name. "Otsa Red Crane," he said first. Only afterward did he explain the changes his own family had learned through that winter. Knowledge, he believed, deserved its proper trail. Spring eventually returned to Raven Butte Basin. The lodge came down in careful stages. The Crowleys began building the cabin they had always planned to raise. The teepee had never been meant to replace every house. It had only proven that a shelter did not have to resemble a cabin to keep a family alive. Elsie adjusted smoke flaps without asking for help. Owen measured the 10-inch snow gap for another settler before winter returned. Mara showed 2 neighboring women how to hang a liner so a shelter could breathe in the right places. As the final poles were lowered, Owen found the short strand of wool that had once revealed the smallest change in draft. He did not throw it away. Instead, he tied it to the handle of his favorite tool. Nature had never spoken. Its verdict had simply been recorded.